wager of democracy is that we should not give all power to competent experts. It was precisely communists in power who legitimized their rule by posing as fake experts. And incidentally, I'm far from believing in ordinary people's wisdom. We often need a master figure to push us out of an inertia. And I'm not afraid to say that forces us to be free. Freedom and responsibility hurt. They require an effort. And the highest function of an authentic master is to literally to awaken us to our freedom. We are not spontaneously really free. Furthermore, I think that social power and authority cannot be directly grounded in competence. In our human universe, power, in the sense of exerting authority, is something much more mysterious, even irrational. Kierkegaard, my and everybody's favorite theologist, wrote, if a child says he will obey his father because his father is a competent and good guy, this is an affront to father's authority. And he applied the same logic to Christ himself. Christ was justified by the fact of being God's son, not by his competencies or capacities. As Kierkegaard put it, every good student of theology can put things better than Christ. There is no such authority in nature. Lobsters may have hierarchy, undoubtedly, but the main guy among them, I don't think he has authority in this sense. Again, the wager of democracy is that, and that's the subtle thing, not against competence and so on, but that political power and competence or expertise should be kept apart. In Stalinism, precisely, they were not kept apart, while already in ancient Greece, they knew that they have to be kept apart, which is why their popular weight was even combined with lottery often. So where does communism, just to conclude, where does communism enter here? Why do I still cling to this cursed name when I know and fully admit the 20th century communist project in all its failure, how it failed giving birth to new forms of murderous terror? Capitalism won, but today, and that's my claim, we can debate about it, the question is, does today's global capitalism contain strong enough antagonisms which prevent its indefinite reproduction? I think there are such antagonisms. The threat of ecological catastrophe, the consequence of new technoscientific developments, especially in biogenetics, and new forms of apartheid. All these antagonisms concern what Marx called commons, the shared substance of our social being. First, of course, the commons of external nature, threatened by pollution, global warming, and so on. Now, let me be precise here. I'm well aware how uncertain analysis and projections are in this domain. It will be certain only when it will be too late. And I am well aware of the temptation to engage in precipitous extrapolations. When I was younger, to give you a critical example, there was in Germany an obsession with Waldsterben, the dying of forests, with predictions that in a couple of decades, Europe will be without forests. But according to recent estimates, there are now more forest areas in Europe than 100 years or 50 years ago. But there is nonetheless, I claim, the prospect of a catastrophe here. Scientific data seem to me at least abundant enough. And we should act in a large-scale collective way. And I also think, this may be critical to some of you, there is a problem with capitalism here for the simple reason that its managers, not because of their evil nature, but that's the logic of capitalism, care to expand self-reproduction, and environmental consequences are simply not part of the game. This is, again, not a moral reproach. And incidentally, so that you will not think that I don't know what I'm talking about, in communist countries, those in power were obsessed with expanded reproduction and were not under public control, so the situation was even worse. So how to act? First, by admitting we are in a deep mess. There is no simple democratic solution here. The idea that people themselves should decide what to do about ecology sounds deep, but it begs an important question, even if their comprehension is not distorted by corporate interests. What qualifies them to pass a judgment in such a delicate matter? Plus, the radical measures advocated by some ecologists can themselves trigger new catastrophes. Let me mention just the idea which is floating around of solar radiation management, the continuous massive dispersal of aerosols into our atmosphere to reflect and absorb sunlight and thus cool the planet. Can we even imagine how the fragile balance of our Earth functions and in what unpredictable ways geoengineering can disturb it? In such times of urgency, when we know we have to act but don't know how to act, thinking is needed. Maybe we should turn around a little bit. Marx's famous Thesis 11. In our new century, we should say that maybe in the last century, we tried all too fast to change the world. The time has come to step back and interpret it. The second threat, the commons of internal nature. With new biogenetic technologies, the creation of a new man, in the literal sense of changing human nature, becomes a realist prospect. I mean primarily so-called popularly neural link, the direct link between our brain and digital machines, and then brains among themselves. This, I think, is the true game changer. The digitalization of our brain opens up unheard of new possibilities of control. Directly sharing your experience with your beloved may appear attractive, but what about sharing them with an agency without you even knowing it? Finally, the common space of humanity itself. We live in one and the same world, which is more and more interconnected, but nonetheless deeply divided. So how to react to this? The first and sadly predominant reaction is the one of protective self-enclosure. The world out there is in a mess. Let's protect ourselves by all kinds of walls. It seems that our countries are run relatively well, but is the mess the so-called rogue countries find themselves in not connected to how we interact with them? Take what is perhaps the ultimate rogue state, Congo. Warlords who rule provinces there are always dealing with Western companies, selling them minerals. Where would our computers be without coltan from Congo? And what about foreign interventions in Iraq and Syria, or by our proxies like Saudi Arabia in Yemen? Here, refugees are created. A new world order is emerging, a world of... Can I just finish the page? 2 minutes, literally. A world of peaceful coexistence of civilizations, but in what way does it function? Forced marriages and homophobia are okay, just that they are limited to another country, which is otherwise fully included into the world market. This is how refugees, again, are created. The second reaction is global capitalism with a human face. Think about socially responsible corporate figures like Bill Gates or George Soros. They passionately support LGBT, they advocate charities and so on. But even in its extreme form, opening up our borders to the refugees, treating them like one of us, they only provide what in medicine is called a symptomatic treatment. The solution is not for the rich Western countries to receive all immigrants, but somehow to try to change the situation which creates massive waves of immigration. And we are complicit in this. Is such a change a utopia? No. the true utopia is that we can survive without such a change. So here I think, I know it's provocative to call this a plea for communism. I do it a little bit to provoke things. But what is needed is nonetheless in all these spheres, I claim, ecology, digital control, unity of the world, capitalist market, which does great things, I admit it, has to be somehow limited, regulated, and so on. Before you say it's a utopia, I will tell you, but just think about in what way global market already functions today. I always thought that neoliberalism is a fake term. If you look closely, you will see that state plays today more important role than ever precisely in the richest capitalist economies. So, you know, the market is already limited, but not in the right way, to put it naively. So, a pessimist conclusion. What will happen? In spite of protests here and there, we will probably continue to slide towards some kind of apocalypse, awaiting large catastrophes to awaken us. So I don't accept any cheap optimism. When somebody tries to convince me that in spite of all the problems, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, my instant reply is yes, and it's probably another train coming towards us. Thank you very much. Please don't do this, because I really think that that's why I hope you, Jordan, agree with it, that's why we are here engaged in this debate. Don't take it as a cheap competition. It may be that, but we are, as you said in your introduction, desperately trying to confront serious problems. I mean, for example, when I mentioned China, I didn't mean to celebrate it. That worries me terribly. My God, is this our future?
No.
Sorry for this. Sorry, please. Discount, take away this from my 10 minutes.
No problem. No problem. No problem.
Dr. Peterson, 10 minutes to you to reply.
So I like to speak extemporaneously, but Dr. Zizek's discussion was so complex that there's no way that I can juggle my responses spontaneously. So, okay, yeah, well, and achievement managed, I would say. So I heard much of what I heard. I agreed with, but we can get to that. I'm going to respond.
Keep that. Pull out the knife.
All right. Well, I heard a criticism of capitalism, but no real support of Marxism. And that's an interesting thing, because for me, the terms of the argument were, well, there were three terms of the argument, let's say. There was capitalism, there was Marxism, and there was happiness. And I would say Dr. Zizek focused probably more on the problems of capitalism and the problems of happiness than on the utility of Marxism. And that actually comes as a surprise to me, because I presumed that much of what I would hear would be a support of something approximating traditional or even a-traditional Marxism, which is why I organized the first part of my talk as an attack against Marxism per se. Okay, so now Zizek points out that there are problems of capitalism. And I would like to say that I'm perfectly aware that there are problems with capitalism. I wasn't defending capitalism, actually, in some sense. I was defending it in comparison to communism, which is not the same thing. Because as Winston Churchill said about democracy, you know, it's the worst form of government there is, except for all the other forms. And so you might say the same thing about capitalism, is that it's the worst form of economic arrangement you could possibly manage, except for every other one that we've ever tried. And I'm dead serious about that. I'm not trying to be flippant. I mean that it isn't obvious to me, when Dr. Zizek is speaking in more apocalyptic terms, it isn't obvious to me that we can solve the problems that confront us. And it's also not a message that I have been purveying that unbridled capitalism per se, as an isolated, what would you say, social economic structure, actually constitutes the proper answer to the problems that confront us. So I haven't made that case in any of the lectures that anything I've written or any of the lectures that I've done, because I don't believe it to be true. He said, well, what's the problems with capitalism? Well, the commodification of cultural life, all life, fair enough. There's something that isn't exactly right about reducing everything to economic competition. And capitalism certainly pushes in that direction. Advertising culture pushes in that direction. Sales and marketing culture pushes in that direction. And there's reasons for that, and I have a certain amount of admiration for the necessity of advertisers and salesmen and marketers. But that doesn't mean that the transformation of all elements of life into commodities in a capitalist sense is the best way forward. I don't think it is the best way forward. I think the evidence for that's actually quite clear. There is, by the way, a relationship. This is something I didn't point out before. There is a relationship between wealth and happiness. It's quite well defined in the psychological literature. Now, it's not exactly obvious whether the happiness measures are measures of happiness or whether they're measures of the absence of misery. And my sense is, as a psychometrician who's looked at these scales, that people are more concerned with not being miserable than they are with being happy. And those are all actually separate emotional states mediated by different psychobiological systems. It's a technical point, but it's an important one. There is a relationship between absolute level of income and self-reported lack of misery or happiness. And it's pretty linear until you hit, I would say, something approximating decent working class income. And so what seems to happen is that wealth makes you happy as long as it keeps the bill collectors at bay. Like once you've got to the point where the misery is staved off as much as it can be by the fact that you're not in absolutely economically dire straits, then adding more money to your life has no relationship whatsoever to your well-being. And so it's clear that past a certain minimal point, additional material provision is not sufficient to, let's say, redeem us individually or socially. And it's certainly the case that the radical wealth production that characterizes capitalism might produce a fatal threat to the structure of our social systems and our broader ecosystems. Who knows? I'm not absolutely convinced of that for a variety of reasons. I mean, Zizek pointed out, for example, that there are more forests in Europe now than there were 100 years ago. There's actually more forests in the entire northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. And the news on the ecological front is not as dismal as the people who put out the most dismal news would have you think. And there is some possibility. That doesn't mean that there aren't elements of it that are dismal. You know, what we've done to the oceans is definitely something catastrophic, and we definitely have our problems. But it is possible that human ingenuity might solve that. What else? There are inequalities generated by capitalism, a proclivity towards a shallow materialism, the probability of corruption. The thing about that for me is those are catastrophes that are part of the struggle for human existence itself and not something to be laid at the feet of any given socio-political system, especially one that seems to be producing a fair modicum of wealth for the poorest section of the population and raising people up to the point where, you know, their lives aren't an unending day-to-day struggle for mere survival. There's some evidence, for example, that if you can get GDP up to about $5,000 per person per year, oh, that's GDP, that people start to become concerned about environmental degradation and start to take actions to prevent it. And so there is some possibility that if we're lucky, we can get the bottom billion or 2 billion people in the world, or 3 billion as the population grows, up to the point where they're wealthy enough so they actually start to care enough about the environment so that we could act collectively to solve environmental problems. Now, you might say, well, by that time we'll be out of Earth. You know, we'll have exhausted the resources that are in front of us so desperately that there's no hope of that. But I would like to remind you of a famous bet between Julian Simon and the biologist at Stanford who wrote, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, they bet, Ehrlich, who thought we were going to be overpopulated by the year 2000, bet Simon that by the year 2000, commodity prices would have increased dramatically as a consequence of evidence that we were running out of material resources. They made a famous bet over a 25-year period, and Ehrlich paid off Simon in the year 2000 because commodity prices went down and not up. And so there is no solid evidence that the fact that our population is growing and will peak out, by the way, at about 9 billion, there's no solid indication that the consequence of that is that we are, in fact, running out of necessary material resources. And so it's a danger, but it's not a danger that's proven. And there is some utility in considering that the addition of several billion more brains to the planet, especially if they were well-nourished brains, as they increasingly are, might help us generate enough problem solvers so that we can stay ahead of the looming ecological catastrophe as our population balloons.